Good evening, one and all. Welcome to another Saving Elephants live stream. The topic tonight, William F. Buckley's 100th birthday. If you don't know who Buckley is, I sure hope you're going to know who he is quite well and why he's important by the end of this conversation. I'm your host, Josh Lewis of Saving Elephants, but I have joining me tonight three very important, distinguished panelists. Bringing on first to the stage here, Eric Cohn. I would say not only are you no stranger to these panels, Eric, and I keep track of this, this is your ninth appearance, and I think,
wow.
Much like Jonah Goldberg, the fifth time the guest is on, they get the gold-plated jacket. I'll when you hit 10, I'll send you a slightly used Saving Elephants coffee mug if you forward your address to me. So,
as long as it's run through the dishwasher, I'm good.
A few stains, but yes, it'll totally be sanitary. Welcoming again to the panel, Michael Lukasik. It's good to have you, Mike, among other things, which you're currently currently I'll say the founder and CEO of Pipe Creek Consulting, if I've got that correct, and former staffer with one Senator Ben Sasse, which is quite a feather in your cap. So always good to have you pick your brain with us.
Thanks for having me on.
And last but not least, the rumors are true. The prodigal son, Cal Davenport, is making a reappearance after I cannot remember how long it's been or how many times I've begged and pleaded for you to come by, but we found a way to get it to work out with your schedule. So part of the old, I had Brooke on in the previous panel, so I'm trying to reconstitute the old Are We Right co-hosts podcast one at a time, but it's good to have you again, Cal.
Well, thanks for having me, and thank you for being persistent and asking me to come on despite all of the times that I have been unable to. It's good to be back.
It is probably my greatest strength, persistence, hopefully not peskiness, because you guys should see the number of people I've tried to have on the podcast that I've literally spent more than a year courting. And sometimes I'm successful, but you, Cal, has certainly not been that difficult by any stretch. It's been a bit since our schedules have lined up. We're having a conversation tonight again about William F. Buckley. His official 100th birthday is tomorrow, but I wanted to get this out of the way tonight for those who would be doing something more, say, an official celebration, because I know the Kirk Center and some other organizations are doing just that. But I honestly kind of struggle with this entire conversation. I say this often. Buckley is one of the four Mount Rushmore Saving Elephants conservatives, right? We've got Edmund Burke, Russell Kirk, Thomas Sowell, and William F. Buckley. And I mean by that, not necessarily someone who is perfect or has reached sort of a level of everything he did was right, but rather when I say conservative, this is what I mean. And I personally believe that Buckley is I won't say perhaps, was the most impactful conservative of the past 100 years. Now, maybe we could argue what that means. Did he, because he didn't seem to write anything that we're still, he's not like Russell Kirk or Edmund Burke, who we're still debating vigorously their works and where they do or don't belong within the conservative pantheon, or Thomas Sowell, who's still cranking out books, as far as I can tell. Buckley wrote a lot, but most of what he did didn't seem to be that the contribution of his pen necessarily. So I want to have a well-rounded conversation about Buckley in general, but I want to start off here for each of you gentlemen. Would you call Buckley the most impactful conservative of the past 100 years? If not, how are you defining impactfulness, perhaps? Or where does he rank there? And who would be the more impactful if not for William F. Buckley?
Not all at once.
Well, I think Matthew Continetti in his book, The Right, which is, I think, the best sort of history of the conservative movement, he makes an interesting argument about Buckley. The two sort of protagonists are, of course, Buckley and Ronald Reagan. And what he sort of does, which I find very interesting, is he sort of depicts the way that Buckley changes over time, whereas Reagan sort of stays constant. So Buckley, when he emerges on the scene, starts National Review, he's very interested in European conservatism, right? His Catholicism is very important to his understanding of conservatism. And that doesn't go away. He's always a faithful Catholic, but his conservatism becomes more and more explicitly Americanist as time goes by. And so I think insofar as that represents the sort of journey that the broader conservative movement went on in the 20th century, I think it's very important for our intellectual history.
I agree that the temptation if one were to give another answer other than Buckley, would be Reagan. And to reference the same book that Michael just referenced, Continetti does a very good job of painting Reagan as kind of an aberration in the history of the conservative movement. And so much of the history of the movement really circles around him as the pinnacles, the culmination of a project. And Continetti does good to point out that like it didn't have to be that way, and in many ways was the exception and it was not the rule. In that sense, I think you probably have to give it to William F. Buckley. I'm, what perhaps somebody, if there's a what is just below a Mount Rushmore, I don't know, but if there's something like a whatever the AAA team is to Mount Rushmore, I'll put George Will on that. And there's this great formulation from Will of, without William F. Buckley, there's no National Review. Without National Review, there's no Goldwater nomination. Without the Goldwater nomination, there isn't the Reagan presidency. Without the Reagan presidency, the wall doesn't come down. Therefore, William F. Buckley Jr. won the Cold War. You can, it's kind of funny, but also there's a point to be had there that especially if you go back and you read Continetti's history of the right, and the great thing about it is, if you read the George Nash book, which is a really great book that really starts around the time that Buckley is just before Buckley is getting going, all in post-war America. What's interesting in Continetti's telling of it is you go back to the 1920s, and the thing that really captured me about that book is the 1920s and the 2020s. Like there's a lot of rhyming going on there in what was going on in the 1920s and the 2020s, even down to the pandemics. And the right is just much more of a bizarre, inchoate, kind of untamable conflagration of people and interests prior to the war resetting it. And I think that actually gives added context to the importance of Buckley and what he was able to do in a post-war environment. And Josh, you'd reference there's not necessarily always a consistency to Buckley. There's not even necessarily there's certainly not a perfection to him. Is he as fallible as any other person? I think one of the great things about Buckley was his ability for self-correction in a lot of these fights. And, one of the frustrating things to me about it now is it's almost reached the status of Buckley being brought up and referenced. And this is one of my frustrations with some of the projects on the new right is people are going back and you can find some quote from Buckley. The man wrote, I don't know how many millions of words over his career. It is like, no, this really represents the true nature of Buckley and his view on this, which is much more in line with what I have to say.
ISI always repeats the whole, ruled by the faculty of Harvard Yard and the Boston Telephone Directory quote.
Right.
That emphasizes populism.
Exactly. And I think the point to be had there is Buckley contained multitudes. He was wrong on plenty of things. He corrected on a good number of them. And perhaps if I had to level a criticism of Buckley, it is that what makes him a little hard to lionize in the way of some other thinkers and writers, or even in the way of some other politicians like Reagan, is he had a foot in both camps. He had a foot in the intellectual camp. He had a foot in the political side. And that, by its nature, is going to direct you in certain ways that aren't always going to be in the name of consistency. Now, I happen to think that consistency is a much overrated virtue. I think that we make way too much out of it. But I think that could be one of the frustrating things about Buckley. But the fact that he played in both arenas, the fact that he was influential from a conservative, less philosophy and more of a prompting of an exploration of ideas and their implications, as well as a direct involvement in the political, is the reason why I think you have to answer the question that he was probably the most important conservative figure of the 20th century.
By the way, and Cal, I obviously want to get your response too, but it'd probably be a good time to mention, I did try to get Matthew Continetti in this panel discussion. He was very kind to reach out and extend regrets he was unable to make it. But he obviously would have been. Both of you have mentioned his book, The Right, right out of the gate. So I would have loved to have had him here, but we'll just have to talk about him instead.
I'll note only what, Cal, before you jump in. It is kind of funny that there's one book that has been mentioned twice already in a conversation about William F. Buckley, and it is not the biography of him that has just come out.
We'll
that
get
I know,
there.
Michael, you probably have additional thoughts on, because I know you have reviewed it. But I think that is a bit of an irony that should at least be pointed out.
Well, so I think I might be the only person on here who has not read Continetti's book yet. What's funny,
you got to get on it.
What's funny though is that I came to the same conclusion just thinking about it. I was thinking through Josh's Mount Rushmore, and I realized there's probably, if there's somebody who's more influential as a conservative, it's somebody like Reagan, who actually served in office, and at the presidential level. I think for people who are not following politics as much, somebody who has the bully pulpit, who is the president, might have a more direct impact on their view of politics and how they vote than somebody who perhaps edits a magazine or interviews people on firing line or things like that. But even with that, I thought I took the same steps that I'm sure I've heard that George Will quote before and stored it away in my subconscious. But I think that I came to the same conclusion that probably Buckley needs to exist for Reagan to exist. So even indirectly, he's as influential as anyone. But I think Eric, your point about the new right and their anybody can find a quote or a point of view on Buckley that is that serves their cause, because he was in the limelight for 60 years or something like that, and in many different mediums. And what I found so fascinating looking at some of the things that have been written recently coming up to his 100th birthday is that I'm finding that exact thing. I'm finding people like in the Spectator recently, Daniel McCarthy references that exact biography that came out recently, and he's trying to make the case that Buckley as a gatekeeper of conservatism may not have really existed from the work that was done by Tannenhouse. And I find that fascinating, but what's more interesting to me is not whether Buckley was or wanted to be a gatekeeper, but that he's probably the only person who had the capacity to do so. And that had something to do with the time that he was in and the fact that he fit it extremely well. I mean, today, even McCarthy sort of admits this. There, he says in this piece that he writes, there is no William F. Buckley today, and given the fragmented nature of media in the 21st century, there will probably never be one again. And I absolutely agree with this. I think that he was the right man for the right time. And that's something that I think can't be said for perhaps anybody else who is in that pantheon of influential American conservatives from the 20th century. There was something about being the man to meet the moment, sort of, that makes him as influential as he was.
Josh, if I could jump in and respond to that really quickly. In a spirit of friendly disagreement, I'm not sure I'm fully on board with what Dan is saying about how it's not possible that there would ever be another William F. Buckley again, for a couple of reasons. First, I acknowledge, technology has changed, and I don't really think Buckley with his multisyllabic words would be great at Twitter. And he was very much a television guy. I'm not sure he would have been great at live streaming, for instance, right? But I think that there is something really timeless about Buckley. And Cal, I don't mean to suggest you disagree with this, but and I actually think it's what made him good as a movement leader and as a gatekeeper, which was his conservatism was very invitational. Right. Reading about Buckley can kind of remind me of reading about Winston Churchill, in that Buckley lived his life like it was an adventure, and he wanted you to come along with it, right? His travel writing is very much in this spirit. Even his spy novels are sort of in this spirit, right? And he sort of treats conservatism as an adventure too, right? And what that means is he's very welcoming, right? He is very broad church. You know, there's a reason why Joe Sobran lasted so long at National Review under Buckley, but also ultimately when people weren't on board with that invitational spirit, that's sort of when you get kicked out of the party. When you become an actual bigot or something like that, right? That's when Buckley, because he wants to invite other people along the adventure, is gonna draw a line. And I think that's a spirit that conservatives really need to sort of embrace again right now. I think part of the problem with contemporary populism is that it's not that it doesn't have that invitational spirit, right? It's just the seething rage, right? And Buckley was an angry man, right? You read the opening editorial for National Review, and he's furious with the 1950s. He is not happy with the state of affairs, right? But he's still going to have fun, right? And I don't really think many of the populists are all that fun, right? Like I don't think Curtis Yarvin is very fun. So Ramari it doesn't seem very fun to me, right? And so you know it might sound simple, but I think part of the thing that Buckley knew that modern day right wingers don't know is that conservatism has to be fun.
2 points on that. The invitational also in the sense of, you know, he was reluctant and loath to try to define the ideology of conservatism, right? I think like the piece that he eventually published on this was notes on a definition of conservatism reluctantly given, or something to that effect. And you know, there is that sense in which, and this is one of the reasons why I at America's Future have started talking a lot about the idea of liberalism and classical liberalism, because I think to me that is the thing as we start breaking into these, it's almost like talking about music, right? Like you can start getting into genres and subgenres of music and you have to figure out where they overlap in the Venn diagram. Like, you know, what does this have pieces of this? And it's got a little bit of that in it. I think you could do the same thing with these ideological flavors. And to me, the thing that kind of is center and is the center circle that over the other circles overlap in the Venn diagram is liberalism. And I think Buckley very much was of that flavor, but there were, you know, plenty of other stripes of conservatism. He didn't seek to define it as it is this one thing and this one thing only. And in that sense, you know, he also called himself a libertarian at different points in his career. That is not followed by a lot of libertarians today, in which they seek to present that there is only one libertarian view on things. And the reality is, to borrow a joke that would probably bother at least a handful of famous libertarians today, libertarians are a lot like Jews in the sense of you get 10 of them in a room, you have 15 different opinions. That is just a reality. Your point on the fun is, to me, one of the defining things about Buckley and one of the reasons that I enjoy him so much. The Hoover Institution, thank you to them for making so many episodes of Firing Line available on YouTube. It used to be that you had to buy the DVDs, and I own, because I'm that kind of gigantic nerd, a bunch of Firing Line DVDs. I've watched a bunch of episodes. Buckley is clearly having fun throughout all of that process. There's the famous quip from his 1965 run for mayor in New York City when he's up against John Lindsay and Abe Beam, where he's asked on Meet the Press, Mr. Buckley, if you win, what is the first thing that you'll do? And his response is demand a recount. I mean, that's just funny. The better one, which had been, I can't remember the very like C-tier YouTube-ish like service that I could only used to be able to find this on. It's on YouTube now. But Buckley made an appearance on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, and it is uproariously funny if you have not seen it, in a way that you can't imagine any conservative figure of the present making an appearance on something similar to what Laugh-In was at that period of time. And like the jokes are just fantastic. Like, how did they get him out there? It's like, well, your producer promised to fly me out on a plane with 2 right wings. The best one, which is a line that I have been waiting to use for years and have just never actually had the opportunity, which is the guy who actually plays the head Illinois Nazi in the Blues Brothers. I can never remember his name. Asks him, Mr. Buckley, I noticed on your television show that you're always seated. Does this mean you can't think on your feet? Buckley is, I find it very difficult to stand bearing the weight of all that I know, which is just a great line. The guy was funny and was having fun doing something serious. And that, we talk about happy warriors a lot. A lot of that spirit has been lost in our modern political age. We have plenty of warriors, and nobody is happy about doing any of it. Nobody is happy about any of it. Everybody's miserable. And they want to make everybody else miserable too. And I think this has a lot to do with the mediums of the time. We were talking about that earlier, whether or not, and I'm not certain that I agree with Michael, that it's possible to have that kind of a figure for the same reason that, we live through this golden age of television, right? And nobody's watching the same thing. So all the shows are brilliant, but nobody is watching the same thing. So it's impossible to have the same kind of conversation. Maybe there is that kind of a character out there. I don't know. Part of the problem too is that like a lot of this is only clear to us in hindsight, right? Like there is some obvious parts about Buckley's role and importance throughout the years, but I mean, for me in my life, right? Like I first discovered Buckley when I get a gift subscription to National Review in 2002. And this is 6 years before he passes. So it's clear at the time, the importance of Buckley, but how clear is it as we move through that period? So I don't know that I necessarily agree that it's possible given the kind of fractured nature of the environment. But the idea of having fun through what he was doing to me sticks out as one of his best qualities, paired with the kind of brilliance of intellect, the quickness that he had, and for the most part, with some notable exceptions, the joy with which he practiced his art.
So let me ask then, because I think this is interesting. We have a potential disagreement, I guess, on the table as to whether or not it's possible to have and these are my words, Buckley 2.0 or a Buckley of the modern era. Sam Tannenhouse in his biography, and I do want to talk about that. We're going to get to that eventually. I've actually had Sam on Saving Elephants twice, once to talk about Chambers and now to talk about Buckley. Consider him to be a friend. He's a very gifted writer. Admittedly, he is not a conservative, so he has more of a broader critique of Buckley than perhaps any of the four of us would. But I have heard him say this so many times. He will be asked, well, who is William F. Buckley today? Like, who is the current Buckley? He says, nobody. He says, there's no William F. Buckley today because there was no William F. Buckley before he came on the scene. Like Tannenhouse himself defines Buckley as this unique figure in this particular time. He does talk often about the difference of the media, but he talks about more than that. He seems to almost think that Buckley was this truly unique, once in a civilization type figure that had this bizarre capacity to pull together a ragtag group of mostly warring intellectuals into a broader political movement, and was able to pivot in such a way that he was both gatekeeper and door opener, right? He was both keeping people out, but also keeping the tent broad enough that it wasn't just a consistent effort of purification. And so I guess my question there being is maybe what we have a disagreement on here, and Michael, please clarify this is so, is which aspect of William F. Buckley is in fact something that could be duplicated. Like there are things that we're not going to see. You know, someone who is truly a TV personality probably could never do what William F. Buckley did today because the median has just gotten too broad. There are ways in which, though, I think a lot of people say, well, who was William F. Buckley? Well, most importantly, it was the life lived, right? That kind of joy that Eric's talking about. Maybe that could be demonstrated in a broad sense. But what do we mean by a William F. Buckley 2.0? What would that even look like?
So I'll stand by my contention that there could be a Buckley 2.0, but I want to raise some problems before I defend that. First, I think it's really important to remember Buckley is an aristocrat, right? This is not a man who is, there's not really a democratic bone in his body, and he is not stooping when he is a public figure, right? I was reading something today about his vocabulary, right? And basically he says, well, if you don't like the big words that I'm using, you need to go spend some time with a dictionary, right? And it's not like a contemptuous, like, I hate the people kind of thing. He loves the people, right? It's just he's not a particularly humble person. He's not a very democratic soul, and I think that a lot of people would react really allergically to that. A lot of people reacted very allergically to that during Buckley's time, but I think that especially on the right today, there's this sort of false humility that we expect public leaders to sort of adopt, right? And even Donald Trump, who's not a humble man, right? He sometimes does this himself, right? Where he makes a bunch of jokes about eating McDonald's all the time and everything, right?
In all fairness, the only word I've ever needed to look up in a dictionary when Trump spoke was bigly.
But that wasn't Buckley, right? He wasn't interested in that kind of lowest common denominator thing, and so I actually think that in a lot of conservative groups today, if somebody with Buckley's character were to show up, they would think he was a snob, right? But I think, and I'm sure that if somebody were to just be doing a bad Buckley imitation, it would be very snobby, right? But I think that the reason I say a Buckley 2.0 is possible is because I think that kind of magnetic personality still attracts people, right? Buckley is still relevant. People still like reading his stuff, right? I have friends who are very attracted to the new right, who are very interested in this sort of rising populist movement, who then went and read Buckley's sailing books and were like, wow, this guy rocks. I wonder what he has to say about politics X, Y, and Z. And it persuaded them to sort of move away from that kind of political extremism, right? And so I think that kind of personal magnetism is something that's still possible today. And that I think we as a conservative movement have to be more open to, even if it means that we abandon some of our democratic prejudices.
The thing to me that is, I think the characteristic that Buckley has that is hard to find in a lot of people is his ability to span so many different divides across different viewpoints of what conservatism is, without obviously getting too broad. Being somebody who is happy and fun and welcoming and inviting, while at the same time being feel very old money with, like his accent and his vocabulary, and playing Bach as the intro to firing line. But I think the biggest thing for me is that he's both firmly rooted in a lot of in a lot of old conservative theory, while at the same time really having a knack for the moment that he finds himself in, both as the founder of National Review and as a TV host at the same time. It's maybe not impossible for those things to come together again, but he also had the perfect medium for that bridge, to be able to be somebody who, to borrow a phrase from the new right, knew what time it was, but also to really be rooted in something. This is why the contradictions of what he might have said over several decades don't matter, because they were all rooted in the same principles. And maybe that shows up differently, or you evolve your understanding of that sort of thing. But he's firmly rooted in this, and yet he's also transcending that time to the modern day, and really taking perfect advantage of the medium and the moment that he finds himself in to translate that. And I think that somebody who spans so many of those different areas, it's just so hard to find in one person. And it was exactly what the conservative movement needed at the time.
I mentioned this before we started, but about 10 years ago, there was a documentary released called Best of Enemies that focused on Buckley's debates with Gore Vidal at the 1968 Republican and Democratic conventions, which, of course, is overshadowed at the Democratic convention by all of the Vietnam War-related protests and everything that goes on in Chicago at the time. And well, I mean, one of the interesting things about that documentary is I think you can tell that there's a bit of a family ties thing going on there, where they didn't intend for the conservative to come off as sympathetic as he does. And part of that is because Gore Vidal is so utterly unlikable that if you're having these two people pitted against each other, you almost have no choice but to come away liking Buckley more, because who wants to come down on the side of somebody who is so unpleasant as Gore Vidal? But the bigger point that the documentary makes is how those interactions presaged a lot of the modern media landscape. So, Michael, the point that you were making that, Buckley's polysyllabic sesquipedalianism is not going to do well in 280 characters. There's an argument to be made that he didn't do well in what's the modern television cable news format either, because Gore Vidal's success in those debates is baiting Buckley into lashing out at him, into losing that kind of unflappability that he always presented himself with. And we know from his writings, his inability to let it go, from what friends of his have said, he was never able to shake that experience that he had. So in that sense, he was kind of, I think, would be ill-suited to this modern media environment. And I think the biggest thing that militates against the idea that there can be another is not as much the fractiousness of the movement. I mean, again, go back to Continetti and to the kind of fractiousness of the conservative or right-wing landscape prior to Buckley arriving and defining it. It's the fractiousness of the media landscape. I mean, I think, Josh, you made the point about like the broadness of the media. I don't think that's the problem with it at all. It's the narrowness of all of it, right? It's like these networks are talking, even the big cable networks are talking to a very sticky couple percentage points of the entire country. There's no opportunity like Buckley had when there were 4 stations, 4 television networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS. And he had a program on PBS. And it allowed a lot of people to discover him in a way that it's just not is going to be possible now. I remember having a conversation with a friend from Chicago who was a musician, who was only kind of quasi interested in this stuff. And he just said, as a kid, we didn't have cable. He was a little older than me. And PBS was on, and just kind of became captivated by this guy lounging in his chair with a clipboard, using words that I had no idea what they meant, in interviewing and debating these people. It's not as much that I don't know who the personality could be, although I don't know who the personality could be. I want to be abundantly clear about that. I don't know that the media environment that we exist in would allow anything like that. The Jonah Goldberg's analogy to the, when people would ask the question of why doesn't National Review play its traditional role as gatekeeper of the conservative movement? And his answer would be, well, they are. The problem is all of the walls came down. They're guarding the gate, but the walls all came down because of the democratization of media, the ability for us to do this kind of thing, right? The fact that we're able, the 4 of us, to get together on this platform and put it out for the consumption of as many people as are willing to watch it is something that was unthinkable 25 years ago. The slowness at which one needed to communicate, the fact that Buckley would write letters back and forth between people, and the fact that the way of doing that, the lack of instantaneous communication, almost requires you to think a little bit more deeply about the things you have to say, rather than to fire it off as quickly as you possibly can. So I think it's less that there could be a personality like Buckley. I mean, certainly there are magnetic personalities out in the landscape, but they are competing for just such small slivers of audience with the ability to reach such small slivers of audience that I just don't think the media environment will allow it.
And there's probably a lot more
suggest-
we could. Oh, go ahead, Cal.
I want to suggest that we've sort of seen some evidence that what you're saying, Eric, is absolutely true. Because I want to not go too far down a rabbit hole, but suggest that there are some parallels, some similarities, and some very big differences, but some similarities between Buckley and Rush Limbaugh in the sense that he was very fun to listen to. He had a very big audience.
One of the final guests on Firing Line, by the way.
And
Right.
I think Buckley himself said he was probably the closest analogous to him.
There was sort of a suggestion of passing that mantle. And I think of, for example, when you talked about what was the name of the show? But the line that Buckley had about the
Rowan and Martin's Laughing.
Yes, it reminds me of when Rush Limbaugh was on Family Guy and was able to make fun of himself so well. There,
Fair
I think
enough.
like that. There's a parallel there, but I think for me personally, over the last probably 10, maybe 15 years of Rush's career, I felt like his content and his point of view was really kind of in decline versus where it was in the 90s and maybe early 2000s. And my own personal view and interpretation, and this is obviously up for debate, but I think that the fracturing of the media landscape made him less of a unifying leading figure and more of a reactionary following figure. And I think that that's where he lost a lot of his edge. If there's some sort of similarity there in how he was sort of the voice of the conservative movement in the 90s and the 2000s, it may also show that when that fragmentation came in media in general, and especially in conservative media, that he really lost the ability to do that effectively, and even maybe arguably, I think, lost his way in many areas.
I was somebody very much raised in this world on talk radio. I had a job over the course of a summer that was incredibly boring and had a lot of downtime, and FM radio was trash. So I flipped over to the AM band. I'm like, oh, I've heard this name Rush Limbaugh, and I started listening and listened to a lot of Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and Glenn Beck. And the thing that was always striking to me about this current moment that, again, I am not enough a scholar of Buckley throughout his life and career. And in fact, maybe Michael, since I know you have done what I have only begun, which is reading the Tannenhouse biography. So maybe you can add some context on this. One of the things that was striking to me about the dawn of the Trump era with Rush is it's the first time that I ever heard him afraid of his audience. That had never been the case as long as I had been listening to him, roughly from 2002. I did stop listening as consistently as the years went by, but I would tune in occasionally at the beginning of 2015 into 2016, and to hear that palpable fear, I think, goes back to my point about the fracturing of the media landscape. There were a lot of other options other than Rush. He did not dominate in the same way. So I think in that sense, it only underscores the point that it is the media environment that changed and the people changed along with it.
I think that goes along with a bigger shift in the conservative movement that Buckley's example demonstrates as well, which is there's a professionalization of the movement that Buckley in part is involved with. But suddenly, especially after the 1990s, people are doing conservatism, political organizing, political commentary, however you want to define that. But people are doing conservatism as a career, right? This is how they're putting bread on the table. That was not Buckley's position, right? He certainly had debts and struggled with debts, but it was always sort of the Buckley fortune, such as it was, that was backstopping National Review, right? Whereas Rush Limbaugh, certainly a very wealthy man, was wealthy because of his radio show, right? And Buckley was wealthy independently of National Review. National Review made him considerably less wealthy, actually, right? Early in the early days, Neil Freeman has written about this for National Review and the American Spectator, among other places. In the early days, Buckley actually had a sort of rule for people involved with National Review, which was this cannot be your job. Like, this is not a job thing. You are here like to volunteer for a movement, basically, right? Not and so he didn't hire people who weren't from those wealthy backgrounds. And so in a certain sense, the democratization of the democratization of the movement of our regime more broadly, that the internet and other technological changes have brought about, they've been good in that they've given lots of people opportunities, and to be sure, like I and I'm not advocating for putting the genie back in the bottle or anything like that, but I do think that there is a big financial question here that ought to be considered as we're thinking about the sort of material causes of William F. Buckley's prominence in the American mind.
I'm still trying to figure out how to sell out with Saving Elephants, but nobody's willing to write me a check yet, so I'll just keep doing it, free of charge.
Every once in a while, one of my good friends and I will just almost fantasize is the wrong word, but try to imagine, like, what if I had absolutely no morals whatsoever and were willing to become a grifter in the way that so many others would? Like, the money would be fantastic. Like, I'd hate myself on a daily basis.
Yeah.
But like, I guess it's kind of the, if I didn't have the morals and was willing to do that, maybe I wouldn't hate myself on a daily basis.
I get it. I get it twice as bad, Eric, because my day job is I'm an auditor, and I can attest that, yes, a life of integrity does not pay as well as fraud.
Josh, have any conservation organizations accidentally sent you a check because of the name?
Check, no. But yes, there's many instances in which I've gotten accidental invites to all kinds of things.
You should go.
I should.
You should show up.
Let me turn then, and this may admittedly not be a topic for the entire panel, but I'm looking at you, Michael. Sam Tannenhaus's, I never know if I should call it an 800 or 900 page book. You throw the notes in there and we're getting to 900. A lot of ink has been spilled on the right about this book. Like I said, I had them on. I recommend people read the book because I think it gives you a pretty good enlightenment of William F. Buckley. I would recommend that you balance it with some maybe more positive views of Buckley's past, if you would, with some other sources. But I asked Tannenhaus himself, and it did seem that I had a very good conversation with him. We were working up towards the end of it, and I said, look, I want to turn to a couple of the criticisms of your work. One of them he completely owned and said, yeah, I don't have any problem with that, which was sort of Matthew Continetti's comment that this is not an intellectual work. If you're looking for like a George Nash's History of Intellectual Conservatism, that's not what you're going to get here. And Tannenhaus himself said, yeah, that's true. I didn't want to write that book. I don't think Buckley wanted me to write that book. But the other criticism that it did seem very much bothered him was the degree to which he focused a lot on the racial aspects of the civil rights movement, and how Buckley, very fair to say, was on the wrong side of that issue and had been for a good long while. And in a sense, he makes amends later in life. But it was more than just the 1960s. I mean, Buckley had aligned himself with all sorts of people that, these days could easily get you canceled for being aligned with. And so I guess I'm not asking you to package your entire thoughts. Well, maybe I am. Your entire thoughts into a single response here. But what is your thought of Sam Tannenhaus's overall work? Do you think let me put it this way, from a liberal perspective, because Tannenhaus is not a conservative, did he treat Buckley fairly? And did he critique him fairly? Or what are your concerns or accolades, if you would, about Tannenhaus's work?
Yeah, so I reviewed the book for Religion and Liberty. I think the title of the review is William F. Buckley, A Man for a Moment, or something to that effect, if viewers want to go and look it up online. And my review actually was fairly negative, which is not to say I feel negatively about the book, actually. I was sort of surprised that it came out as a negative review, because I actually really enjoyed the book as I was reading it.
He's a good writer.
Brilliantly written, which I think Buckley admired about Tannenhouse and would have
Yeah.
admired about this biography. But I also think that this focus on these racial questions is really profoundly important. It's not something the conservative movement can or should run away from. And I say that as somebody who's a real admirer of Southern conservatives like Richard Weaver, the Fugitives, the Southern Agrarians, who were bad on these questions, right? And I think Buckley was bad on these questions partly because he was reading those conservatives and was really influenced by them. So I like the book. I recommend people who are interested in this read this. And I appreciate the focus on the racial questions. I'm not sure though that Tannenhouse ultimately comes to fully understand Buckley or his evolution or his struggle with these things, right? As somebody who admires Weaver, but has ancestors who fought for the Union Army, right? And I'm very proud of those ancestors. I think obviously the bigotry, the prejudice, that's despicable. There is no excuse that can be made for that.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think if you place it in the context of the 20th century's broader anxieties, right? In some ways, and I think Robert Penn Warren is a good example of somebody who, like Buckley, evolved on this question. He started out as a segregationist, then he started interviewing civil rights leaders and sort of realized, oh my gosh, this is a really unjust system that we've imposed, and we need to get rid of it. Buckley never goes quite as far as Warren, of course. Which even later in life, I think that there is a lack of clarity to some of Buckley's statements about these questions. That is not the best. But I think the problem with Tannenhouse's approach to this is that he's not coming at it from Buckley's perspective. He's not trying to understand Buckley as he understood himself. He's understanding Buckley as a liberal understands Buckley, right? And right. I think that's a kind of failure as a biographer, actually. I think that in some ways the best biographies take on the perspective of their subjects, right? And so I think there's actually a sort of strange lack of empathy in some ways when it comes to Tannenhouse's biographical art, such as it is. And I think this is reflected in other ways in the book too, right? The book, I think, sort of becomes a kind of Forrest Gump style history of the 20th century, where instead of Forrest Gump, it's William F. Buckley, right? And I'm not sure I don't really care for Forrest Gump, and I'm not really sure that I'm interested in reading a 900-page book like that a second time, for instance.
Yeah,
right?
there are entire passages where you can go on and forget you're reading about Buckley.
Right. And I think that's a real flaw in the book, actually. I think probably some of that has to do, and now I want to be empathetic to Tannenhouse. It's really hard to do. He'd been working on this for a very long time. There was a lot of pressure on him. And I think that probably his publisher put a lot of pressure on him to put out the book for the centenary, right? And so I think that ultimately most of the book's flaws can basically be chalked up to the fact that I think it's a fundamentally incomplete book. I don't think the complete biography of Buckley has been written. I'm not sure that anyone's going to try to take on the challenge anytime soon now that Tannenhouse's book is out. But I think maybe 50 years from now, somebody might be able to write a more complete biography of the man.
I did tell him that the majority of the criticisms could all be boiled down to, dude, your 900 pages is too short.
Well, it's either far too long for a single volume biography, or it needed to become like that Lyndon Johnson series where it needed to be over multiple volumes. But I think he was working on this for 30 years, and it's at that point you're approaching George R.R. Martin level of frustrations for the bro, are you ever gonna finish the damn book? The answer with Martin, of course, is no, he never is. Josh, if I can kind of commandeer the hosting for a moment here and ask Michael like two questions. One, for a lot of the racial stuff, how much of that for Buckley? I'm going to ask you a question about Buckley and a question about Tannenhouse. For the Buckley side of it, how much of it is what I pointed out earlier about, yes, Buckley is reading these, Southern conservative writers, but he has one foot in the intellectual camp and another foot in the political camp. And how much of it was trying to navigate the politics of the time in ways that would keep a political movement together. Not to say that, Buckley should be excused for the things that he wrote, certainly not being viewed through the lens of people at the time who would have criticized him for it and the way that we would view it now. But how much of it was because of a political project? And then the second question that kind of dovetails into is how much of Tannenhaus's problem is presentism, is wanting to evaluate people in the past by the mores of the present that would, of course, look back at those things in disgust, much the way that Robbie George with his class at Princeton will ask them, how many of you in the post-Civil War Jim Crow South would have been against that? And all the hands in the class go up, and he says, you're all wrong and liars, right? Because you would have gone along with the spirit of the time, which would have made you do and believe these things, even if you think that you wouldn't have.
Yeah, so I'll defend Tannenhouse from the charge of presentism a little bit. I don't think that's quite his fault. Tannenhouse is not as old as Buckley, obviously, but he is older than any of us on the stream, right? And he is a sort of old liberal, right? And so I think it's not so much a question of present versus past, so much as it is a question of liberal versus conservative, actually, right? And so I think it's more of an ideological question than a question of presentism as such. With regard to the Buckley thing, I think one of the difficult things to reckon with is the way in which the pro-segregation movement was bound up with anti-communism, which is really the defining cause of Buckley's life. From very, very early on, his father, sees his business go up in flames during a left-wing revolution in Mexico, right? The communism is really the specter haunting Buckley, and a lot of segregationists, Weaver's famous National Review editorial on this was titled "Segregation is Communization," right? And there was this sort of identification of especially Black radicalism with third worldism or even Soviet communism. And so I think in that sense, a lot of what Buckley is doing actually comes down to a sort of misguided attempt to further his own anti-communist crusade, a crusade with which I fully endorse, right? I think fight against totalitarianism was the ultimate question of the 20th century, but I do think that it led Buckley to some dubious conclusions about domestic politics. Conclusions which I'll add other conservatives don't share, right? So I think a good example of this is actually Russell Kirk, who didn't write a ton about segregation and was certainly not an anti-segregation activist or anything like that. But he did write admiringly about civil rights leaders such as Malcolm X, I really do think that Buckley was blind to things that other conservatives, even Brent Bozell, his brother-in-law, sort of pulls him aside a couple of times throughout his life and is like, dude, this race stuff is maybe not the best. And so I think Bozell deserves a lot of credit for pulling Buckley away from that toxicity.
I will now forever, the voice of reason. Yeah. The guy, the founder of Triumph magazine is the voice of reason in all of this. I now forever will, I am not a playwright. And if there's anyone out there who is, I need a one act play imagining what dinner between Malcolm X and Russell Kirk would have been like.
They were on the radio together once.
Really?
Kirk wrote a reflection about meeting Malcolm X, and he calls him a prince among men. That was his term for Malcolm X.
That's going to be the next smash Broadway musical. Hey, our time is limited, which is very regretful because there are so many cans opened here. I would love to explore the biography further. I would love to explore the race question further, because I'm in agreement with you, Michael, that it's something that I think is extremely needful we do not shy away from, and that we're cautious to not sort of sweep under the rug like so many on the right do. That is not what I'm trying to do by moving on. It's rather, it's just due to the limitations of time. I wanted to give everyone a chance to give closing thoughts, but I'm going to ask a final question if you want to wrap your closing thoughts in that, and that is this. It's the very unfair, hey, if this guy were alive today, what would he think? Right? And I'm asking that in part because at the beginning of this conversation, I kind of mentioned he's one of the four on my Mount Rushmore of conservatism. He is a problematic figure. I admire Buckley in so many ways. He's entertaining, he's enlightening. I think understanding how he did life, we would all do well to try to emulate that in a lot of ways. He also aligned himself with forces that I think, as they have come to fruition over these last, say, 40 plus years, have shown themselves to be the very radical forces that Saving Elephants itself stands against. And I know collectively you individuals, we may all be different in certain regards, but I know you well enough to know that you are not, that you share equal frustrations and concerns about the radicalization of the right today. Buckley himself, when he was younger, referred to himself as a radical conservative. You know, the opening issues of National Review, which I think echo a lot of Wilmore Kendall, although it's a little bit, his populism is very different than the populism on offer today, but still was very anti-liberal in a sense that sometimes I wonder, did they confuse classical liberalism with the progressivism that we stand athwart today, if you will? And so I'm wondering here, while I think it is fair to look to Buckley as this great conservative figure, he did contain multitudes. And, you know, there are exceptions. Tucker Carlson disowned the guy, which, thank God, I'm grateful when screwballs like Carlson say, you know, identify Buckley as one of the great, what do you call him, the great villain of the 20th century or something that, I don't know. I would have picked Hitler. But apparently Buckley was the one sticking.
Well, he wasn't even the greatest villain of World War II, as his show has enlightened us. So there you go.
Fair enough. Sorry, I probably should not invoke the T word this late in conversation.
Not this late in the show. No.
So where I'm going with that is, and I'm not trying to say that when I say the radical elements of the right, I don't mean your Nick Fuentes flirting with Nazism. I don't think Buckley was the forefather of them. I mean, rather the sort of odious populism that has gone off the rails, that misidentifies, in my view, the classical conservative tradition was just sort of our main purpose is to own the libs, and, you know, to evoke liberal tears, if you will, even if that means we are ironically borrowing left-wing policies to do it. So all this being said is, where does Buckley fit in there? Is it true that he's imperfect? Is it true that he birthed movements that maybe he had not intended to? Or am I the one who doesn't fully appreciate Buckley? Maybe Buckley, were he alive today, would say it's actually the Saving Elephants crew that don't fully understand the conservatism I am profiting.
I think that if Buckley were around today in his prime, he would probably agree with everything that I think. Is that presentism? No. So here's the thing. Knowing what I know about Buckley and his desire to try to span these different divides, what I'm very curious about is, I think that a lot of, for all the fragmentation in the media, I think it's one of its defining characteristics is that it forces you to pick a side. You can't stand in the middle very long before being pushed and pulled to one side or another. And I'm curious where he would end up coming down. I don't want to imagine that he is, because of his stature, that he's a mythical figure that would somehow be immune to all of that. And would he go the way of Rush Limbaugh and become afraid of his audience, or would he, form a remnant like Jonah Goldberg, or like, what exactly does that look like? And part of the reason that I'm not 100% for all my admiration for him, and I do think that he is in the Mount Rushmore of 20th century conservative. He doesn't, if he lived if prime William F. Buckley were alive today, he wouldn't have the benefit of himself and his own experiences to work from. He would have to learn them all again, just like he did he would need a Brett Bozell maybe to correct him a couple of times, and he would need to go through those evolutions, and he would need to be disowned by whoever today's Ayn Rand is, and he would need to disown whoever today, I guess today it is still the John Birch Society somehow. I think there would be a journey that he would be sort of inviting us on, and I don't know exactly where it would go.
My politics are not a secret. I still actually consider myself something of a never Trumper, right? I'm even willing to go places Jonah maybe isn't willing to go on that. And so I have very little sympathy for the populist movement as it's currently constituted, running Washington, D.C., sort of merging with the Republican establishment, as it were. But I think for conservatives of a more classical disposition, Buckley is actually a reminder that not all forms of populism are bad, right? I do think that Harvard phone or the Boston phone book line is one of the most important things Buckley said, and I think that's why a lot of people admired him, looked to him, and were entertained by his aristocratic habits of thought and action, right? But I think he's able to combine that sense of fun with a genuine anger and frustration at the establishment, right? Like Buckley, throughout his whole life, even as he's sort of hanging out in New York high society and has a PBS show, he's never actually quite in the establishment. And I think that's really important. I also don't think Buckley really wanted to go into the establishment, right? I think he kind of, in part because of, and I think this is where Tannenhaus's book really shines, I think in part because of the strangeness of his upbringing, he's always sort of, even as he loves America and loves the American people and the American traditions, he's always sort of at odds with the American establishment. And I think that's something conservatives ought to embrace a little bit more. I think that's what the best conservatives in our tradition, Russell Kirk, William F. Buckley, others, have always done, right? And I think that there's a real temptation in this moment as we're sort of frustrated by the vulgarities of populism as it's currently constituted, as we sort of roll our eyes at the new absurdities coming out of the Trump White House. I think there's this temptation to sort of say, well, all of us liberal institutionalists have to just sort of band together and get along. And to be sure, there are things that we can do with liberals across the aisle that we should do. But I think ultimately what Buckley teaches us is that the vast body of the people, to use Churchill's phrase, they're fundamentally conservative, right? And I think that appealing to those conservative instincts is what can rescue us from the vulgarity of present day populism. Not shying away from those conservative instincts, not shying away from the good sense of the people for the sake of some kind of institutionalism or something like that. Sometimes you do have to play with a little bit of fire. And also it's fun to play with fire sometimes.
I think those are both wonderful thoughts. And to cut to the heart of Josh's question of if Buckley were around now, what would he think of all of this? I think my answer is I don't know, and I don't care. I think what Buckley would want us to do is to look to the thinkers that have existed before and who have navigated the experiences and the circumstances that they had to deal with and learn what we can from them and form our own conclusions about the balance to be struck between these kinds of parts of the world, the populism that Michael is talking about, the aristocratic sense of that there are going to be elites and that we need elites in society, and figure out how we navigate these times. I think that would be the lesson that he would want us to take, and that's the one I'm going to take.
I think the best kind of panel discussions are the ones in which I literally cannot improve upon the closing thoughts the panelists have offered. So I'm just going to close it there. I appreciate every one of you guys, your insight. We could have easily gone on for another hour. We just barely scratched the surface. But thank you so much for bringing your thoughts about this most remarkable of individuals. Eric, Michael, Cal, thank you guys for coming on. Thank you, everyone, who hung on in the live stream. I know there's a lot of comments going back and forth, a lot of colorful comments I'll add. I appreciate all the participation, and we will see you guys next time.
Thanks.